Hey, 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 oh. It's all part of us, but we can all choose love.
The Choose Love movement offers no-cost solutions that keep our kids safe, providing them with the skills and tools they need to flourish. Join us in our mission to create the world we want to live in, one that's connected and compassionate. Check us out at chooselovemovement.org. Together, we can choose love.
Hi, everyone. It's Scarlett Lewis, the founder of the Jessie Lewis Choose Love movement. I am here with Shannon Deslutz, who is the director of the Choose Love movement out of Governor Sununu's office in New Hampshire, and Dan Jewiss, who is the founder and president of RAC. And we're going to be talking to him about his organization and really focusing today on school safety. Choose Love movement focuses on one end of the pathway to violence, and that is the grievance end. We focus on having connected, compassionate, loving school cultures, and that in itself can reduce and prevent a grievance that can eventually might escalate into an attack, and I guess I should say, it also gives students and educators the skills and tools they need to manage that grievance within themselves and help others manage it so that also it does not escalate. And so that's really what I have been focused on the last 10 years in the Choose Love movement, is proactive prevention of the pain that might eventually escalate into not only violence, but substance abuse and mental illness and just suffering in general. And Shannon, my dear friend who I met 10 years ago when she came down to do trauma treatment in Sandy Hook. I'm laying on your, pretty progressive trauma treatment, and laying on your table, talking about how I wanted to be part of the solution. And then you saying, well, gosh, when you have whatever your vision is in place, contact me. I did. And then amazingly, 10 years later, she's now working out of Governor Sununu's office for the last 4 years.
4 years.
As the director of the Choose Love movement. Wow.
Yes. So first and foremost, the biggest hat I wear is I'm a mom. So when you would share with me about your foundation, you can bet I wanted this in my son's school. Through a series of events, I was able to be connected with our First Lady, Valerie Sununu, in New Hampshire, and share with her about the foundation, get the backstory, introduce her to you. Scarlett came up, we had a meeting with her and the governor, and it was right around the time the governor had our School Safety Preparedness Task Force writing our school safety report, which was published in July of 2018. And he did a beautiful job highlighting the need for social emotional learning. It really became the backbone of the report as preventative, proactive measures. And then he went on to hire me as program director to spread Choose Love throughout the state of New Hampshire, where I now serve as a big member on our School Safety Preparedness Task Force as well.
So I thought it would be really great to have Shannon here today to talk with you as well, Dan, because she's very active in school safety, as am I, but on the other end. And so I'm so honored to have you here because you were the lead investigator, or really still are the lead investigator for the Sandy Hook school shooting. And I'm going to read your bio because it's really interesting. Dan retired in 2021, after serving 23 years with the Connecticut State Police. He began his career as a road trooper patrolling the northwest corner of Connecticut. He then spent 12 years as a detective in the elite Western District Major Crime Squad, where he investigated numerous felony cases such as homicide, bank robberies, sexual assaults, financial crimes, and most notably, the 2012 Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting. As the lead investigator of that tragedy, Dan still remains committed to supporting the victims and their families And I can personally validate that as one of the victims' families. Dan also spent 7 years as an instructor at the Connecticut State Police Training Academy, where his primary role as a post-certified instructor were teaching leadership and team building, search and seizure case law, as well as active shooter response. Dan also served 20 years in the Connecticut Army National Guard. During his military career, Dan served full-time for 3 years in counter-drug operations, where he helped establish military-based training for local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies. As a sergeant first class, he was selected to be a TAC, T-A-C, for Officer Candidate School, where he was selected to be a TAC for Officer, we can edit this. So sorry. Is it, should I say TAC? Is that what you say?
Yeah, it's an acronym. But it is
okay.
called TAC, yes.
Okay. Sorry. Okay. We will, thank goodness for me, we can edit this. Okay. During his military career, Dan served full-time for 3 years in counter-drug operations, where he helped establish military-based training for local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies. As his sergeant first class, he was selected to be a TAC for Officer Candidate School, where he became a certified Army instructor and platoon trainer. He helped develop, coordinate, and conduct leadership training to mentor soldiers to become commissioned officers in the United States Army. Dan eventually became the chief instructor at OCS and then battalion operations non-commissioned officer at the Leadership Regiment at Camp Niantic in Connecticut before he retired in 2011 at the rank of Master Sergeant. In the private arena, Dan has been conducting training since 2008. He's the founder and president of the RAC Academy, where Dan and his co-instructors teach audiences easy to understand and affordable strategies to save lives in active killer incidents. Well, we're going to talk about why you call it that. The RAC Academy's primary audiences are first responders, school personnel, houses of worship, communities, and businesses. Dan is also a senior associate at Team Training Associates, a certified everything DISC workplace instructor, and a co-creator of the performance leadership model. In all his capacities, Dan strives to inspire his audiences. In all his capacities, Dan strives to inspire his audiences to become positive influences in their families, workplaces, and communities. He's also the proud father of 2 beautiful daughters. Dan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me. And Shannon, it's so good to meet you.
Great to meet you.
Yeah, this is awesome. And you and I had dinner the other night, and I have to say that, in a world, unfortunately, that's focused now in schools on lockdowns and active shooter prevention, you really shocked me in a few of the things that you said. I mean, I don't focus on the attack end of the pathway to violence, but the things that you said were really shocking and changed the way that I looked at that end. And I wanted to discuss that with you today. I mean, I think that, the world that I know is focused on lockdowns and see something, say something. So in other words, you lock everybody down if there's an incident. And then if you see something, you tell a trusted adult. And, I mean, that's just I would have gladly gone along with that, except that you were explaining things to me that just made so much common sense that I really wanted to get you on a podcast so that you could tell all of the educators and administrators and parents really kind of where the response to active shooting has gone and what the latest is, because you are absolutely so credible in being, an instructor of this and have so much knowledge with all of the history that you've had all the way back to Sandy Hook. We're 10 years out now from Sandy Hook. So can you tell us about that?
Sure. Well, I'll first address that harsh language, right? Because I know when I explained that that my company name is RAK, Response to Active Killers, you even had that reaction that it's some harsh language. But the reality is that's what we're dealing with here. We're not dealing with just active aggressors or assailants or threats. Active killers, it really has to stand alone, not only in the name, but more importantly, in the response that we do. And the reason why we use killer instead of shooter is because we're learning that they're learning how to use other weapons other than just guns. So we need to be able to protect ourselves and react to other types of threats and weapon systems other than just somebody that's shooting, even though it's still the most prominent weapon that's used. But that's why we chose that active killer phrase. Obviously, age dependent. If we were in a school system and we were dealing with younger kids, we would soften that up quite a bit. And I hear a lot of times that there's a huge barrier with just starting the conversation about what to do in these responses for the best of intentions, because of the concern for those kids and the fact that educators don't want to traumatize them. And I can certainly empathize with that, because we don't want to traumatize them either. But I would say somehow we have to come together and figure out a way to do it. And there are proven ways to do it. And I just use the example of the fact that we teach them how to react in a fire, right? And we break it down into simpler terms of stop, drop, and roll. But, having a fire in your building is a pretty horrific event. And so is having somebody that's firing a weapon in your building. So there are ways that we can actually do it. We just have to work together so that we understand it from both sides.
So that's really interesting. How would you soften it for an elementary school, say? What would the languaging be that you would use?
Sure. I would just simply put it as, bad guy. It would be dependent on each area about, what type of language they're already familiar with. But I know when those kids talked back to us, that's the language that they typed to use. When we were dealing with 6 and 7 year olds, they were talking about, the bad guy. And that's okay. That's enough for us. We don't have to put that phrase of killer or shooter with that, in that response. However, what we should know, and what's more important, is not the label that we put on it with them. It's that we've taught them how to properly react in that situation so that they can save as many lives as possible. And when we distort it, when we confuse it, when we overlap it with other names such as, assailant, aggressor, there's, we look at situations like Uvalde where they're using that lockdown name. And it leaves a bad taste in my mouth to even say that. But so many school systems are using lockdown, not just for active killer or active shooter incidents. They're using it for any type of threat at all. And what that does is it makes people complacent. It really downplays the importance of what has to stand alone. When somebody comes into your facility, whether it's a school, a church, a business, and their sole intent is to kill as many people as possible, that is a reaction that your people have to know how to be prepared to react in that single event, which is the worst thing that they're going to face. And therefore, we can't get it confused with any type of event, because those other events, they happen, not more regular than we would like. And we announce them and we react to them, and then nothing happens. There's a police pursuit that's coming through your school area. And so we contact the school, which is what we should do. And they end up calling lockdown, and everybody reacts. And then by the school year goes on, and we get 4 or 5 pursuits that are going on, or we use it for a foul weather plan, or there's just some stranger out in the parking lot or on the playground, and we call lockdown over and over and over again, and it gets distorted, and people get slow to react and complacent, because so many of those times bad things don't end up happening. But in this event, they have to know that this is the worst thing that could happen. At least our staff need to know that. And so therefore, whatever name we use for it has got to stand alone by itself.
Well, you're talking about, there's so many things in there to unpack, but you're talking about just say it like it is, RAC, reactive, active killer. response to active killer. I'm sorry. I remember one of the first phone calls that I took from a reporter after Jesse's murder, and my mom, and she was standing right next to me, and I was using the word murder. My son was murdered, and I got off the phone, and my mom was like, "Oh God, could you soften that word a little bit? Like, I don't know what you could use, maybe died or killed. Like, murder just sounds so awful." And I remember turning to her and saying, we have to say it like it is. Yeah. He was murdered. He didn't just die. He was viciously murdered. And we actually should use the correct verbiage, because this is serious stuff. And this is what's happening, and there is no softening it. So I'm totally on board. So you're saying that lockdowns, people get used to doing lockdowns and they get complacent. When did lockdowns start, and why did we just kind of move into lockdown as a response to active shooter?
Sure. I'll tell you, one of the mistakes that we make in law enforcement when we go to trainings or when we share information, and we now see it in the school systems, is that we simply take other people's answers, right? We share those lessons learned, and we find out what somebody else is doing. And if that's better than what we're doing, we kind of adopt it. Mm-hmm. But what we don't do enough is go back to what the questions are that those answers go to. And if we went back to the question of what should we do when somebody comes in our facility trying to kill as many people as possible, we wouldn't have ended up with lockdown. But lockdown came from in the wake of Columbine, when school systems really had no plan in place to react to any type of gunfire, gun threats on their school grounds, except for the LA public school systems, because they were already dealing with so much gang violence. So they had instituted this thing called lockdown, because if there were two gangbangers out on the playground and they would end up shooting it out, or they were doing drugs and the police came and they were going to chase them, they developed lockdown because the safest thing to do would be if there were kids outside the school, say at recess or on the playground or just getting off the bus, they would hurry them inside and they would lock the doors so that they couldn't be in that wake of that threat by those gangbangers. And so then they would lock all the exterior doors, and just as a precaution, they would lock those interior doors. And then there was a series of events that they gave teachers to do, such as to hurry up to the window and close the exterior blinds. And then because they didn't want these kids and staff getting hit by shards of glass or stray bullets, they would have already designated the safest interior corner in a room that they could all huddle into. And they would gather into that corner and they would turn off the lights and stay quiet. There weren't cell phones back then, but they would stay quiet until the announcement that came that the threat was gone. And that was actually a pretty good response to the type of threat that they designed it for. But because schools had no answer in the wake of Columbine, and they heard about this thing called lockdown, they basically adopted it. And here we are over 20 years later, and schools are still using lockdown, even though it doesn't fit at all. I used to go around and have crucial conversations with school administrators and ask them or suggest that they take out certain parts of lockdown. I've actually gotten away from that. Now what I say is forget everything you knew about lockdown. Just sit down at the table with your key personnel, your SROs, your threat assessment team, your decision makers, and say, what is the best response we can do if somebody comes in our facility or is in our school grounds and their intent is to kill as many people as possible? You would then still choose some things from lockdown, which is you should lock the doors. And in most cases, we should already have our doors already locked. But certainly if there's somebody inside our building shooting, we shouldn't bring kids that are outside into the building where the threat is. It doesn't make any sense, but we're not thinking like that. We're just following some plan that's been given to us that we followed for so long. We take time to close the blinds on exterior windows, when yet if we look at the data, there's never any guarantees, but when we look at the data of hundreds of active killer incidents, there's only been a couple where a shooter is actually engaged from the outside. And yet we're taking time and possibly putting ourselves at risk to actually go close those blinds. when really the people that can't see when they get there now are law enforcement. Now, if there's blinds on interior windows, those might make sense to actually close the blinds. And certainly it makes sense to lock interior doors, because what we haven't seen yet is any type of active killer actually breach a locked door, an interior locked door. Obviously in Sandy Hook, he actually breached an exterior locked door, but interior locked doors, they haven't actually gotten through. They have shot.
The interior, I want to say the doors in Sandy Hook were not locked.
Well, correct.
A lot of them.
Correct. A lot of them, some locked, some didn't lock. And so some of that goes into, what are you spending your time doing? Because you probably only got, there's 2 or 3 minutes that you're surviving by yourself. The data tells us that the average response time to law enforcement in these things is about 3 minutes. So you've got some time that basically you're your own first responders. So yes, locking an interior door is one of the best things you can do, unless you have an exterior door that you should be running out. Then don't even waste the time of locking your interior door. If it's fairly safe to get out your exterior door, then get out.
Yeah. And you say on your website, 70% of active killer incidents are over in 5 minutes or less. What will you do with your 300 seconds? I mean, that's what we're talking about right now.
Absolutely. And so we really have to figure out what is the most important things for us to do. And lockdown is not the model that we should be going from. Sadly enough, there's a reason oftentimes why we lose more victims. And we can look at it from Columbine to Sandy Hook to Uvalde, Virginia Tech, where we have victims hiding under desks or tables or gathered in one corner of the room. And the reality is that if that killer ends up coming in the room because they actually breached the door, because the door wasn't locked, whatever the reason is, having all your potential victims gathered in one location actually makes it easier for that person to take more lives than it is if they were still spread out. And it's really sad that we just don't understand that basic concept, that gathering them together in our active killer situation is not the right thing to do.
And that just makes so much sense. And even if you look at Sandy Hook, there were 2 classrooms. The doors were supposed to be locked. They were not. And when the shooter came into the first classroom, that happened to be my son Jesse's classroom, the kids were scattered and they ran out of an open door, while the teacher in the next room, doing the best that she could, was hiding them in a bathroom. And when the shooter then went out of the first classroom and into the second classroom, he killed everybody in the room because they were all there in one place. And so, I know that's a graphic description of what happened, but it is so important that we learn from our mistakes and move through them and grow in our response, which is what you're talking about today.
Absolutely. And we can practice that with kids without traumatizing them. Right? And we have actually, you mentioned those first graders, 6 and 7-year-olds from Sandy Hook. The only reason why they're alive today is because they self-evacuated in the worst of conditions, but they were never trained to do that. They basically did it on their own. Now, they had been evacuated before, but they had always been led by a staff member, usually in a single file, holding hands, going all the way down to the firehouse. In this situation, our staff members weren't there anymore because the data tells us, it shouldn't be a surprise that oftentimes the first people that are shot are the adults that are in that room, whether the person is actually tactically thinking that way or just because they're the largest individual. They're often the ones that are standing up while other people are seated, and they might be the one that actually moves to confront the killer. For all those reasons, it's often that they're actually shot first. And if we haven't trained our kids what to do when they no longer have an adult in their room, then we really set them up for the worst type of failure.
If you have any questions, please go ahead. But
thank you so much, Dan. I mean, it's such a hard subject to be talking about, but it's so vital. What are some of, I know like New Hampshire's local control state. Okay. So each district can choose what they want to bring forward. Is that the same here in Connecticut too?
It is pretty much across the country. There's some states that are a little more strict, but there's a lot of autonomy with your superintendents.
Yeah. So what are some of the challenges that you run into with that? Because I know, it's obviously there are challenges too.
Sure. Well, the first, I think, is communication of proper information, right? Many of them learned lockdown some time ago, and they're still stuck in that. So they do it because they believe in it. And unfortunately, the one day that's going to prove to you that it doesn't work is going to be the worst day. And we can't afford to have that day come. Every day we do it in training, every day that we do it when the pursuit goes through or there's a drug deal going on in the parking lot, it works. But it doesn't work. It's not the best response when it comes to these days. And by the time that happens, it's too late. So one is communication about really what the data is telling us. Just like law enforcement has to really appreciate what academia knows about education and concern for kids, we have to do a better job of understanding that, and also how important that training calendar is, and how to somehow come in and do things without disrupting a lot of that. Academia has to understand that just because they're put into a position, they don't become an active killer response expert, because there really isn't there oftentimes is not good enough training out them for that. So going off of something that's over 20 years old, law enforcement had significant lessons from Columbine as well. And it's taken us quite a while to change those things. So this is not specific to academia. It's across the board. Things like Uvalde tell us that we still have a lot of blind spots, but communication and understanding about what the data is telling us is really the first of those things. And then I think the second is just some creativity about how to implement training into your training calendar. Oftentimes, even if I get through to a superintendent or a principal or somebody and they're full of energy and they're like, you know what, I'm going to organize a drill and we're going to get a hold of the police and fire and EMS. And I'm like, oh, slow down, right? Because training tells us, not just in these events, but training that we're doing with our recruits, we need to use a crawl, walk, run. We need to develop good individual habits and then build them up so that we get to a faster pace that we can do on a larger scale. And if we try to do that too quick, we're just going to do a lot of things wrong. And we're going to check the box because it looks good in training. And yet we're going to spend a lot of time and a lot of money. And that also means that we're probably not going to do it for quite a while afterwards. And yet there are some very simple things that we can do, which doesn't disrupt our training days. And one of the things is just understanding that timeline. And Scarlett and I talked about this over dinner the other night. And that is this concept of shaving seconds. Mm-hmm. We know from Sandy Hook and from so many of these things, one of the best things that we can do to stop that type of threat is to get a police officer on scene to stop that threat. That's why SROs are so important in these type of situations, is because if they are on scene and they actually react correctly, their response time should be close to zero. But that's not the case in many of these instances. So how do we do that? And when we look at the timeline, the people that start that timeline are in your school systems. And as Scarlett said, we have these campaigns like see something, say something. But if the ladder of information has to go from a student to a staff member to call the office so that they can brief the principal or whatever decision maker is going to make the decision about calling 911 and calling whatever we're calling our active killer lockdown procedure, we're going to give away a ton of seconds. And that whole time that killer is inside doing whatever they want to do. And that's just way too slow there. 43% of these incidents, we find that law enforcement presence alone causes the killer to do one of several things: to either commit suicide, barricade in a way that no one else is still in danger, to flee, or to start shooting at the police. And in all those instances, that's much better than them still killing innocent civilians. So that's a very positive effect just by getting law enforcement on scene. So how do we do that? We have to teach people in schools about how to quickly make that 911 call. And when they make it, what's the most important information to give? And if that information has to go all the way up through this basically chain of command, we're going to give away a lot of time, which is a lot of trigger squeezes. And unfortunately, we're going to lose a lot more lives. So teaching people how to make 911 calls are important. And I would say we would want to push that all the way down to the lowest level. You know, why not teach kids how to do that? And why not teach them what the most important information is for them to give? Because they can use that anywhere in their life. It's really an opportunity to teach them life skills, because whether they're at the mall or in church or at a sporting event or in your school, and whether it's an active killer or somebody, a teacher having a heart attack, or a kid that sliced an artery, or somebody having a seizure, the way they make those 911 calls is the difference between life and death. So why not teach them that skill? And we can practice those reps by simply saying that once a quarter, or whenever I stop you in the hallway, or whenever I come in and say, make your 911 call, you now have to actually know how to make that call. And it may seem so simple, and I don't know how deep you want to go into it, but 911 calls are not simple, especially under that stress, unless we've actually taught them. And knowing that in addition to saying those two important things, such as Sandy Hook School, active killer, right? So that's a significant event in a general location. The next piece of information that you have to give is where specifically is the killer. Because that's what first responding officers will use the most and the quickest to stop the threat. And yet we can go on YouTube and listen to calls from Columbine all the way up to very recent, where very well-intentioned, panicked callers are saying things about where they are, how many people are shot, the reason why somebody got fired, the name of the student. All of those things are really good for an investigator, but it's not going to save lives. What's going to save lives is where specifically is that killer. And that language has to make sense. So at Sandy Hook, when the callers are calling from inside room number 9, and they're telling our dispatchers, the shooter is right outside of room number 9, and they put that out over the radio, that didn't mean much to most of those responding officers, because they don't know your school and they don't know where room number 9 is.
Right.
So saying something just like he's in the front hallway, first floor, that's general enough, but it's more specific, because if they say he's on the soccer field in the back, they should be driving around your school and across those athletic fields to get there as quick as possible, instead of stopping at the front of your school. So where specifically, you don't need exact row numbers, but boy, if you're at a mall and you just say the general address of the mall or the location of the mall, and officers park at Macy's on one far end when they should have parked at, I don't know, all these places have gone out of business, JCPenney on the other end. I mean, think about how much time that's going to waste before those officers get down there. And unfortunately, that's a lot of trigger squeezes, and it's probably a lot of lives.
You know, I know listening to you, Dan, I'm sure that listeners too have a sense of, I mean, we're talking about a really difficult topic, and there's a lot of fear involved in that. But I think that really important to remember that there's also a little saying, name it to tame it. And, you know, there's this underlying anxiety that so many people have now, parents and kids and educators, about school violence. And so they have a fear in the back of their mind. And, you know, you're talking about a solution, and it's hard to hear, but I think the bottom line is, when you have training, when it is addressed, that can reduce the anxiety and can also definitely help with reaction time if you've practiced this. And if you are confident and you know what to do, that is so helpful in reducing the stress around all of this. Do you agree?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, it is obviously, as a parent myself, like, it's hard. I'm not going to lie. When my son graduated high school, it was bittersweet for me. It was sad. My baby was growing up and going off to college. But let's be honest, I also breathed a sigh of relief. He made it through without a school shooting. That's a pretty raw moment of honesty right there, but it's true. And it's sad that we do think that way. But I of course, doing what I do and helping the community down here in Newtown, Sandy Hook with post-trauma therapy, even now, 10 years later, that fuels me in my work in New Hampshire to drive the Choose Love movement forward as proactive preventative measures. I don't want to see a single community go through what I've witnessed down here. And, I know many, many people are overwhelmed and so much on their plates, and it's easy to say, I don't have time. You don't have time to deal with an aftermath of a massive tragedy. And I think it's just, we need to have these conversations. We need to have these honest moments and do all we can for the safety of our children and adults.
And not having them and not really naming the issue and not using the real words, as you say, watering them down. I think it just adds to the anxiety for sure. Mm-hmm. So go ahead.
It does, because I'll tell you, I've talked with kids and it's changed since, now we've been having these conversations for probably about 8 years. And initially there were kids that they were still able to live in that world of hope, right? They didn't know about it. They weren't hearing it on TV. Their friends weren't talking about it. And so, you could understandably at least maybe make that decision to kind of shield them from the conversation and hope that it never happens to them. Those days are gone. I mean, kids at a very young age are talking about this, mm-hmm. and you're in control of the conversation. Some mm-hmm. of them are telling me, we have no idea what we're doing, or mm-hmm. what we're doing doesn't make any sense. Mm-hmm. And I know how you have to do it every day that we do it, but there's no way I'm going to do it mm-hmm. on that day. And actually, that's what I told my daughters, right? Because my daughters were still in school as all these new procedures started kicking in. And I told my daughters, listen, every day that you do that training, you follow exactly what your teacher does. But I'm telling you, if you ever feel that it's real and you've got that exit door in your classroom, one of them, my oldest daughter, her classroom backed up to a state park. I said, you have an exit door in your classroom. Unless you feel like there's somebody bad outside of that door, get out that door and go find your happy place in the woods. And those conversations are not just coming from police officers. They are coming from parents all the time. And we're really missing the mark. We misunderstand what we're doing. And that is not good for those kids at all. Because not only does that cause our kids, rightfully so, to doubt the response that is being taught to them by our schools, but think about that. If they doubt what you're teaching them in what they feel is one of the most important life things that could happen to them, what else are they doubting about all the other things that you're teaching them, which have nothing to do with active killer response? And yet you actually have an opportunity. And I know you might feel like, well, this shouldn't fall under schools, but what you have an opportunity to do is to teach them life skills that they can apply anywhere else. Because the data tells us that it's still unlikely it's going to happen in your school, but it's getting more likely that it's going to happen at their church, at the mall, in a movie theater, at a concert. That's getting more and more likely that it's going to happen sometime throughout their life. And wouldn't it be great if we could give them a foundation of proper response? And that response is not just follow an adult. It's not just listen to your administrator. It's what you yourself can do to save your life and other people's lives. That's what I really think it's about.
And it's giving the students and educators that confidence that they would know what to do and that they're comfortable and that it makes sense. I remember after, Sandy Hook had just had active shooter training 3 weeks, I think, the Sandy Hook Elementary School before the tragedy. And I remember after dinner one night, my mom and I were still sitting at the table and Jesse ran in, and I didn't even question why he asked me this. He said, "Mom, what would I do if a shooter came into the school?" And so just kind of casually, I said, well, you would run zigzag. And he was like, okay. And he turned and he ran off. But I didn't ask him, why did you ask me that? I didn't further the conversation. But just the fact that he came home and asked me that question means that he was thinking about it, and he was maybe questioning what he'd been told, wondering if I agreed with that, even though we didn't have that further conversation. And the things that I'm hearing are that, yes, even if this isn't being discussed in the classroom, the kids are talking about it on the bus, and they have the information now on their cell phones. They're reading the news. They talk about it amongst themselves. And so it really absolutely needs to be addressed. And I was asking you if you were receiving resistance from this and what you're doing and the message that you're spreading.
Oh, there's still a lot of resistance out there. And, when Greg and Lisa Crane started Alice, they really designed the first run, hide, fight. Now there's all different names and acronyms that are used, but they basically all go back to the same formation. When Greg and Lisa Crane, Greg as a police officer and Lisa as working in academia, designed it in the wake of Columbine, they were laughed out of places. And now Alice is worldwide. And, it's time that we really have to wake up and understand that some version of run, hide, fight is where we need to be. And I know our conversation that we had over dinner, we talked about the fact that when parents first give their kids a cell phone, or when they first leave them alone in the house for just a few minutes while they run to the neighbor's house or something, oftentimes they'll give them some basic instructions about what to do if something goes wrong, right? If the house is caught on fire, it's get out and go to the neighbor's house and call 911 as quick as possible, right? And if you give them a cell phone, you should have a conversation with them about if they see something, a car accident, something. In all of those instances, you don't expect them to call you first. Mm-hmm. And yet, for some reason, if you look at a lot of our emergency response plans in academia, the person they're supposed to call first is a staff member. And that's going to get passed up the chain because of the organizational bureaucracy and how disruptive it is to have a false announcement of an active killer. And I feel for you, because you're trying to cram as much training as you can into the calendar. But when you look at what's going to happen if that thing is real, and you've had to micromanage it and decide whether it's real, and that information's got to get passed up the chain of command, we're going to literally lose people because of it. And there is nowhere else on this earth that teachers, cafeteria workers, or students would call somebody else before they call police if they had a chance on saving somebody else's life. Nowhere else on this earth. But for some reason, when they step onto your school grounds, I don't know what is more surprising, that we still have administrators that actually put that in policy, mm-hmm. or that we still have people that actually follow that policy on the day it's happening. Mm. Because when I ask them, would you give up your job to save people's lives? They go, yep. I go, do you think that if you called directly, that would save people's lives? They say yes. And yet still on that day, they don't do it. And that's a whole nother conversation about habits and how under stress, we're going to go back to what our habits are. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's really dangerous for us to lose the opportunity to not teach them the most appropriate response, not just if it happens on our school grounds, but if it happens anywhere else in their life. Mm. I mean, how proud would you be if you had taught somebody? And again, we don't have to teach 6-year-olds the full gamut of what we're doing, mm-hmm. but we can start the conversation. And because we started it there, we can just add on a little bit more each year. And by the time they get to high school, they're probably responding better than we are, right? Because some of them are playing sports under a lot of stress. They're in Explorer programs. They're volunteering at your fire department. Some of them actually might be quicker and better to react than, some of those workers in the schools. But because we started younger and we kept building on that, we get them to a such better place, rather than just going, we're not going to empower them at all until they get to be 16 or something. And then we're going to throw all this on them, or we're never going to throw it on them. Like That just doesn't work. And so, what if one of them were at the mall on the weekend and tragically there was a shooting, and they knew to run away from the sound of gunfire, and they knew that when it was as safe as possible to do it, to call 911 directly, not call their parent, not call the school, but call directly to 911, and that they actually knew that the most important piece of information for them to give was where specifically that shooter was. And that got police on scene and close to the shooter so that they stopped the threat. And the police would look at that and go, that caller saved lives. And how great would it be, because they're going to interview that person, for that person to say, you know where I learned how to do that? I learned to do it in my school. It's a life skill that we have an opportunity to teach them.
And I think that that's an important thing to stress, is that this is a life skill that you might, hopefully not use it in school, but you can also use it in your life. You would use it anywhere, because even if you're not a part of a school shooting, and you're right, I think that's less likely to happen than being struck directly by lightning. The chances are you will be in some situation, a car wreck, or witness something, or in some situation where you're going to have to make that 911 call, and knowing how to say it, keeping your calm, because it's a habit and you have practiced these skills and tools for a long time, is really important.
It is. And there's a lot there. It's the good thing is we're not talking about spending thousands of dollars on some type of security equipment. I'm not saying that none of those are important. However, what we're talking about is human behavior. And when we make that better, then we make our response better, and we could take it anywhere. And I think the single most thing that will have the most impact on stopping school shootings is the success rate. You're working on, at Choose Love, a lot of upstream type of things, which is so vital. It's so important. What we deal with at the RAC Academy is, unfortunately, whatever we had in place didn't work, and somebody's at our doorstep trying to kill as many people as possible. But one of the greatest impacts we could have is that these people will look at that and look at schools as a target and say, they're getting a lot better. Like, I'm not going to go down in the history books. I'm not going to become infamous. That alone, the fact that not only do we want to save lives because we want to save lives, but we want to stop this pattern of success. There's two things that they look for. They look for a high body count, and they look for notoriety. And unfortunately, we don't have control over the press, but they give these people a lot of notoriety.
Absolutely.
They plaster their name and their face all over the place, and we don't talk enough about the victims. So they're still getting that. But what we should work on is trying to save as many lives as possible, because that alone will have a significant impact, not necessarily on their thought process. Maybe they take it somewhere else, and then we have to work on those locations. But one of the best things we can do is just knock down the success rate of what they have. When I look at Flight 93, which I know it's not necessarily what we think of as an active shooter, an active killer incident, but those civilians on Flight 93 saved lives by taking the fight to those hijackers. Now, they weren't able to save their own lives, but it was the only chance they had. But they definitely saved other people's lives, and they had no training. But they just knew that really they were in a situation 30,000 feet in the air where they had no other options. We should treat that. We should bring that to the ground level and know that when somebody gets inside our classroom, when somebody comes inside our building and we're so close, sometimes we don't have any other option. And it's so hard to talk about fight with some of these people. But one of the things that we have to use to our advantage is our overwhelming number of people. That's why they chose our location. So you don't have to make your students or your staff, your family, you don't have to make them trained fighters. We simply have to use the same numbers that they're looking for, which is why they're at our location, and turn around and use it against them. When I talk to church groups, and they're some of the most challenging community members that we deal with, because they're often older and they have some physical challenges and stuff. And yet when I stand up in front of a church group of 30, 40 people and I say, Right now, if I'm fully armed, but you decide to charge me, there's no way I can stop you, even with all my law enforcement and military training, from you eventually subduing me. However, if you try and hide in those pews, as long as I have enough ammunition, fight is going to be your best option. And we don't have to get everybody. You know, there were 3 Americans on a train in France. That wasn't everybody that was on that train, but that was 3 Americans that quickly made a decision when somebody stood up with a rifle. And with a simple head nod, they said, we're going at him instead of away from him. Mm-hmm. They saved lives. And we do have good examples. We have students and we have staff that have actually charged at these people and saved lives. Tragically, we have lost some of them, but we would have lost a lot more people if we did this other form of lockdown and just decided to hide. They know you're there. It's not like they can't see you under a desk or that table gives you any type of protection. Mm-hmm. It's sad that we're still losing people that way.
And Jesse called for his classmates to run, and they did. So that's unfortunately where we are today, and it's the reality of it, and we need to face it. And so to wrap it up, I'd like to wrap it up on a choose love note, and your thoughts about the importance of having a comprehensive essential life skills program being taught in schools in every single grade level, teaching emotional management, self-regulation, healthy relationships, how to face pain and grow through it. And of course, Choose Love specifically teaches courage. But there are lots of programs out there that include, parents and communities, as Choose Love does. What are your thoughts about the importance of that as it pertains to school safety?
It's so critical. We're so worried about traumatizing kids and we're worried about their physical safety. And yet one of the greatest skills that we can teach them is exactly what you're doing. We're never going to be able to guard them their whole life, nor would they be better off if we did, because they wouldn't be stronger. And we talked about post-traumatic growth and the fact that we can actually grow from that. But just like the example of if we go from 0 to trying to teach everything about active killer response, it's going to be too much. In the same sense, if we guard them, and never have them deal with any type of struggle or pain, and then all of a sudden ask them to deal with something that's extremely traumatic, it doesn't matter what training we gave to them right before then, they're not going to be prepared. And so as parents, as educators, just as people that care about other people, there's got to be some type of development through that. And your program is just amazing with that. And so absolutely, as a parent, those are the conversations that I wanted to have with my kids. Obviously, they knew what type of work I did. So we had a lot of tough conversations. I didn't have to tell them all the details about stuff, but I told them about a lot of important things. And I remember one other thing that we had talked about over dinner, and that's the fact that whether we're having these conversations with our kids or we work in a law enforcement field and we're dealing with this heartache that we deal with all the time. And I'll tell you, police dispatchers are not given enough credit. That's why we do a lot of training with them, and they deal with a lot of heartache. So this mental health aspect hits everybody. And one of the things that happened in the wake of Sandy Hook was, I knew that my girls that were tweens at the time were going to be home waiting for me and have lots of questions. And I knew at some point we were going to do questions and answers, right? Not right away, but at some point I was going to make sure that they had the proper information as opposed to what was getting put out there. But I also wanted to share with them some positive things, because even in the wake of that tragedy of Sandy Hook, right off the bat, there was some amazing things that were getting done, not just in that community, but throughout the world. And so when I pulled in my driveway that first day home, I opened up a section on my phone in the notes section, and I called it Bright Spots. And I just started recording some of the amazing things that was going on. And I made sure that when I talked to my girls about it, that I also shared with them, just some amazing stories. And so when we do our training, oftentimes what I'll do is we'll obviously talk about some very hard things, but before we take a break, every time we'll go over a quick bright spot so that people remember why they joined this profession or what good we can actually do in the world. And the fact that it really takes love amongst all of us to make some good things happen.
Dan, first of all, thank you so much for joining us today. You have been a bright spot, I know, for the victims' families since day one. And you hold a special place in my mom's heart and mine and Bob's and our entire family. We appreciate you so much. You've been there for us for a decade, and I know you'll be there for us forever. And we're so grateful. You are our bright spot. I want to thank you for that. Shannon, did you have any follow-up questions or anything that you wanted to add?
I think what you just said, Dan, was the perfect way to wrap this time up. And I truly thank you for your service.
Yeah.
For everything you've done
Absolutely.
over the years.
Yeah.
But really, what you just said, I think, was the perfect way to end this discussion.
Thanks for being with us, Dan. We're going to include all of your information in our post so that people who are interested in having your specific training that you offer through the RAC Academy that you founded, they can contact you. I know that you go out and you do training for, over all sorts of different scenarios and situations, as well as places for corporations and places of worship and in communities and in addition to schools. So we will make sure that everybody has all of your contact information.
Thank you, Scarlett. And let's grab dinner again soon. It was an amazing night.
Absolutely. Let's do that. And thank you for joining the Choose Love
Your
podcast.
mom for me. Bye, Shannon.
Bye.
I will. Dan, before you go, can you just record just saying one thing? Can you say, in talking about Alice, Alice stands for alert, lockdown, inform, counter, evacuate?
Correct.
Or I can say that. I can say, Dan's talking about the Alice active shooter training, and Alice stands for alert, lockdown, inform, counter, and evacuate, just so that everybody has a context to what the Alice training is.
Thank you. Thank you for putting that in there. And Shannon, I don't know if you're anywhere close to Claremont, but I'll actually be up there in, I believe, March.
Oh, really?
Doing a 2-day dispatch response to active killers. So maybe we can get together for dinner, or you
That'd
could
be fantastic. Where will you be?
Could she go?
Oh, absolutely. And you could, you know what? Bring whoever you want with you, even though it's focused towards dispatchers.
Yeah.
I guarantee you that if you brought whoever you brought would get something out of it, because the concepts are the same across the board. We're obviously going to zero in on stuff for dispatchers, but we're going to talk about school safety. We're going to talk about police response. So it's actually at the Claremont. I can send you, if we make sure that we have each other's email, I'll send you the training announcement. I believe it's actually at the Claremont Bank. But the deputy chief of Claremont Police Department is a retired state trooper, Mark Grasso. And so he's been sending dispatchers to our trainings for years. And so it's fortunate that they're going to actually host a course up there.
I would love it. Please definitely send that. My brother and dad are retired state troopers in New Hampshire too. And my niece is about to enter state police in New Hampshire. So yeah, big spot in my heart for you all, but I would love to be part of that training for sure.
Absolutely. Well, I'll be in touch.
Thank you.
Awesome. I'll introduce you to.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Dan, so much. Good to see you.
Give my best to your mom.
I will.
All right. Bye.
It'll lift you up if you let it in. Let the healing begin. So won't you turn it up and tune it in and sing it loud over again. It's all part of us. We can all choose love.